So, Steve, it's great to have you on the Historical Faith Society. And I don't know if you know this, but we've created this new society that's going to be looking at how do we preserve the historical credibility of the Bible and then pass on a biblical worldview to the next generation. We've been excited to have John Lennox and his new film, Against the Tide, as one of our first big events. So tell me a little bit about John Lennox. From your point of view, who is John Lennox?
Well, John's a terrific guy and an extraordinary figure within what we might still call Christendom. He's an Oxford professor of mathematics and the philosophy of science. He's a very distinguished algebraist, quite an expert in the specialized discipline within mathematics of algebra and algebraic theory. And he's also a very committed Christian and a very deep thinker about issues of how science and faith intersect. And I had the privilege of interviewing him twice in the run-up to the release of the film that's been made about his life. And we had just a fascinating conversation about the scientific evidence for the existence of God, some of the things that you and I will probably talk about today. Also historical evidence for the reliability of the Bible, and some of the extraordinary episodes in his life. I did not know until we actually got to preview the film that he'd spent a good deal of time in Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall, teaching the Bible in academic settings, sometimes very much under the radar. He's quite a linguist among his many other talents. So he's a mathematician, he's a philosopher, he knows German, he knows Russian. He's just pretty amazing. So I think your audience will enjoy talking to him.
Absolutely. Why are you interested in the Bible, Steve? Well,
I'm a Christian. And I had a kind of a long, tortuous conversion experience that involved asking an awful lot of questions. Some of them metaphysical, some of them about the meaning of life, but some precisely about the reliability of the Bible and about whether or not the biblical revelation stood up to close critical scrutiny, whether that was about the question of God's existence in the first place, or the question of the reliability of the historical narratives, or claims about, for example, the divinity of Christ. And eventually, I found answers to those questions that satisfied me. And there was a certain point in my mid-20s where, after a long period of angst and wrestling, I finally kind of ignited and said, "Yeah, I'm ready to go. This is the truth, and I want to build my life on it, and I want to serve the God who has revealed Himself to me in so many different ways."
Yes, there's a lot of young people today that have questions, and I know that has been times in Christianity where people have just said, "Well, just have faith. Don't worry about that." Why doesn't that work for a lot of young people today?
Well, I don't think it works for many people, actually. In the book of Hebrews, it says that faith is the evidence of things hoped for. And the idea that Christianity is simply a private and subjective sentiment or feeling, or an idea that makes us feel good or gives us comfort without a grounding in events that took place within time and space and history, in which the God of the universe revealed Himself to mankind, is not satisfying. And I think right now we have, Francis Schaeffer used to talk about the upper story and the lower story, the upper story being the story of philosophy and meaning and worldview and faith, if you will. And the lower story was the realm of facts. And he said that there's been a separation in modern Christianity between those two realms. Whereas if you look at the understanding of the Bible writers themselves, they believe that, for example, the events of the New Testament were based on their eyewitness testimony, and facts were and are very much part of the Christian faith. And right now we have a situation where the secular knowledge culture is very secular and assumes that they have the facts. And when they encounter Christians or Orthodox Jews, people of the book, they say, "Well, you have the faith, we have the facts." And that's an argument that the believers always lose. I mean, so I taught a course when I was a college professor called Reasons for Faith. And I used to tell my students, the heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects. Eventually, I mean, you can sing a lot of praise songs, but if you don't really believe that what you are singing about actually happened and is true in an objective sense, you will lose that passion, especially as soon as you're challenged by people who want to say, no, this didn't really happen, or this is not credible, or this is incoherent, or whatever the charge is. So
yes, and so you and I have talked. I remember when we first met. I think it was there was an attorney who wrote. What was his name?
Philip Johnson, probably.
Philip Johnson, yeah. So I think I was tracking down Philip Johnson, and I got a hold of you, and we talked for hours at times about the possibilities, and here we are continuing on, and you've written some wonderful books. I've got them, and they are thick, where you've built a case for a creator that is intelligent. And what is the intelligent design movement all about?
Well, the idea of intelligent design is that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence rather than an undirected or unguided process, such as, say, natural selection acting on random variation. The intelligent design argument was initially framed as a challenge to Darwinian evolution. Evolution can mean lots of things. It can mean change over time. It can mean common ancestry, or it can mean, in its most important sense, it can mean an undirected, unguided process, usually conceived of as natural selection acting on random variation, that can explain away the appearance of design in living organisms. So all biologists recognize that living organisms look as though they were designed for a purpose. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the famous proponent of modern Darwinism, says that biology is the study of the things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But the Darwinian argument is that appearance of design in living systems is an illusion. And it's an illusion because there's an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection acting on random mutations and other forms of variation, that produce that appearance, but without being guided, without that process being guided in any way. So there's no mind behind it, no purposive intelligence behind the process. And so that's the meaning of evolution that the intelligent design movement is challenging. And we're saying that no, things look designed because they really are designed. And you can tell by looking at the evidence. And there's a number of classes of evidence that we've focused on. For example, Michael Behe has focused on these little tiny miniature machines and circuits that are being found in cells that have not been explained by gradualistic Darwinian processes, but instead have all the hallmarks of design systems. I've focused in my work, especially in the two books that you mentioned, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, on the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule and which is essential for building the proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. So in our computer world, if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to provide code, you have to provide information. And it turns out the same thing is true in the living world. If you want to build a new form of life, or if you want to build life in the first place, you have to have information stored in DNA or some equivalent molecule. And the origin of that information is the most profound of all mysteries in modern evolutionary biology. It's not something that's been explained for multiple reasons that I discuss in my books, but there is an explanation for the origin of information, and we know of that because of our own experience of producing information. Information always comes from a mind, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, or information embedded in a radio signal, or information in digital code in a software program. Information is always the product of mind. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life, I've argued, is a powerful indicator of the existence of the pre-existence of a mind before the creation of life. And so that's another one of the key arguments. There's also in physics evidence for design and what's known as the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. So it's a new way to look at life in the universe that acknowledges and in fact detects the activity of a designing mind in the origin of the universe and life.
So fundamentally then is that a cell, which people might have thought was very simplistic, actually was much more complex, and there was an intelligent information inside that cell.
Well, right. In the 19th century, one of my favorite quotations is from one of Darwin's contemporaries and his famous bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, who kind of took his argument into the public square. And Huxley argued that the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. They thought of the cell, the simplest unit of life, as a kind of chemical jello, and that it would be very easy to produce by a series of undirected chemical reactions. But we've now discovered that cells are complex on the order of sophisticated factories that are run by digital information. We have a technology today that is called CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and engineering. And we find something conceptually exactly equivalent to CAD/CAM at the foundation of life. It's information directing the construction of mechanical parts and systems. And in the biological context, it's information directing the parts of machines that are made of proteins. So this is something Darwin had no inkling about. Michael Behe's title, Darwin's Black Box, is apt. The cell was a black box to 19th century scientists. But once the black box has been opened up and we've discovered the circuitry, the machines, the information processing systems, it's mind-boggling. It's stunning. And I've been in molecular biology courses where people literally gasped when they realized the sophistication of the systems that were at work, upon which our very lives and the lives of every single living organism on Earth, including the very simplest cells, depend.
Steve, so what is Darwin's Doubt, the book that you wrote?
Well, my first book, Signature in the Cell, was about the origin of the first life, a mystery that Darwin himself acknowledged he hadn't solved, and which hasn't been solved from an evolutionary point of view from the 1859 right to the present. And that was about the evidence of design present in the digital code within the DNA molecule. Darwin's Doubt was a sequel to the book, and that is about another event in the history of life, the origin of the first animals. And there was a major explosion of animal life in a period in the fossil record called the Cambrian explosion, about 530 million years ago, plus or minus, depending on which paleontologist you talk to. And in that major event, there were numerous what are called body plans, the distinctive organization of body parts and tissues that are exemplified in different kinds of animals. So these fundamentally new body plans emerged in fundamentally new forms of animal life. And just as you need information to build the first living cell, you also need information to build new forms of life from pre-existing forms of life. And so the book looked at two big mysteries. The first mystery I called the mystery of the missing fossils, that you have all these major forms of life that emerge abruptly in the fossil record with no discernible ancestral precursors, as you would expect if Darwin's gradual evolutionary model were true. In his model, you would expect that major forms of life would have arisen as simpler forms, morphed and changed, and gradually produced those more complex forms. What you see is very distinct new forms of animal life that bear no discernible similarity to anything in the lower ancestral rock record, in the sedimentary record. But the second mystery I addressed was, well, how would the evolutionary process, or how would anything build those new forms of animal life, understanding as we now do that to build new cells, new tissues, new organs, and certainly new body plans, you need a lot of new information. Where did that information come from? And commutation and selection, the Darwinian mechanism that is supposed to have this creative power, could it generate the new information required? And there I looked at, for example, what we know from computer science about how if you have a section of functional digital code and you begin to randomly mutate the zeros and ones, if you randomly change them, you're going to degrade that information very quickly, and it will lose function, and you'll get your program will shut down. And so very oddly, the Darwinian mechanism posits a very similar process. Random changes to pre-existing code as a way of generating new code. And yet I show in the book that that's not plausible for not only because of what we know about computer systems, but for mathematical reasons. And I looked at a number of other challenges to the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism, but then again affirmed that and argued that we do know, however, of a cause that can produce information, and that cause is intelligence. Bill Gates says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. And we know from experience, again, that software arises from intelligent programmers, and indeed all information, especially information in a digital form, as we find it in the DNA molecule and in our own software, all such information arises from a mind, not a material process. So these sudden bursts of information that are necessary to build the new form that also bursts on the scene in this abrupt way in the fossil record, I argue is evidence of the prior activity of a designing intelligence.
And what you're basically saying is that these cells have such complexity to them that there's no way that they were just jello.
Well, I'm saying a little more than that. It's not just that they're so complex they couldn't have evolved. That would be just a negative argument. Mm-hmm. I'm arguing that the type of complexity they have, the informational signatures that they possess, are distinctive in our experience of the activity of an intelligence. In other words, we have positive knowledge of the kind of cause that's necessary to produce the crucial effect, the crucial features of living system. It's an informational complexity, a genuine that functions as an information transmission system, a genuine code, and we know of only one type of cause that produces that. So in the absence of any other causal explanation, and given our knowledge of the positive connection between mind and the generation of information, I argue that the origin of that information is best explained by the activity of a designing mind. And imagine, for example, that you were to walk into a cave, maybe, very in Antarctica or at the southern tip of South America, some remote region, and you've never been in there before. You're an archaeologist, and you start hunting around, and you shine your flashlight on the backs of the cave, and you find a set of inscriptions. Now, you've never been there before. You don't know that anyone else has ever been there before. But as you look at the inscriptions, and you see some of them are pictographs, you see some of them seem to have some sort of symbolic representation, you realize that there's information inscribed on the side of the cave, and so you immediately discern that someone has been there before. And when Watson and Crick opened up, as it were, the interior workings of the cell and were able to discern the structure of the DNA molecule, they recognized that it was functioning like a 4-character alphabetic code. And in fact, in 1957, 4 years after their first discovery, Francis Crick put forward something called the sequence hypothesis, in which he posited that the 4 chemical subunits on the interior of the DNA molecule, chemists actually represent them with letters A, C, G, and T. He posited that they are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written text, or we would now also say like the zeros and ones in a section of software code. And that is to say that the function they performed was not a product of their chemical properties or their shape or their atomic weights, but rather their arrangement in accord with a symbol convention later discovered and now known as the genetic code. So you had a genetic text functioning in accord with a genetic code at the foundation of life. So it'd be very much like walking into a cave and finding those inscriptions, or maybe an archaeological example like the Rosetta Stone, where the archaeologists found that famous stone with 3 different forms of script inscribed on the rock. They were eventually able to translate one to each of the different scripts and realize this was genuinely meaningful information. And that's what we found at the foundation of life. And we know of only one thing that generates such meaningful or functional or specified information, and that is, again, a mind. And so the discovery of information at the foundation of life is a powerful indicator of the activity of a designing mind in the history of life.
I hadn't thought of it that way before. When you brought up the concept of the cave, I filmed the scene with recreating Sir Flinders Petrie and Hilda when they went into this cave in the Sinai and saw what would be the first alphabetic inscriptions, realizing that there was a presence there, an intelligence, and
one had been there. A mind was responsible for that. That's not the province of wind and erosion or chemical etchings undirected by an intelligence, right?
So you're focusing in on, I'm going to throw out just a concept. In some ways, not that DNA is the language of God, but in a way it's the language of life, right? But it's an intelligence that has brought together life in itself. And the reason why I bring this out is that words are important. And in the it says in I think it's John, in the beginning was the Word,
In the beginning was the Word, right?
And the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
In Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, I argued that the information in DNA was, in fact, a powerful indicator of a prior designing intelligence, the language of some intelligence. In my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, I'm bringing in other evidence to actually make the case that in effect, the digital code in the DNA is the language of God, as Francis Collins put it in his famous title.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the new book. It's coming out this year. It's called The God Hypothesis. And why did you write this book?
Well, after the first two books, a number of my readers said, raised a really understandable question, which is, you say, Dr. Meyer, that there's evidence of designing intelligence in life. Who do you think that designing intelligence is, and what can science tell us about that? And now, in the first book, looking only at biology and the origin of life and the origin of the first animals, I argued simply that a mind of some kind was responsible. And I did that because of our uniform and repeated experience of the connection between mind or intelligence and the generation of information. And in a sense, it's appropriate that I'm talking to your historical faith society, because what my work in my grad school years in England was on the methods that scientists use to discover or to investigate events in the remote past, the historical scientific method. And so using that historical scientific method, in fact, the very method that Darwin used in The Origin of Species, I was able to establish that at least there was a designing intelligence of some kind, because we have a distinctive effect of intelligence evident in biological systems. We know of no other cause other than intelligence that produces that effect, again, functional or digital information. And therefore, we can infer as the best explanation that a mind played a role. And that's as far as I took the argument. But people wanted to know, well, what do you think about the identity of that intelligence? In a film about 10 years ago called Expelled, Richard Dawkins speculated that there might be a signature of intelligence in the cell. And if so, it would have had to, that intelligence would have had to have evolved by some sort of Darwinian processes, and it would have but maybe in some remote region of space, and then life was seeded here on Earth. That's a hypothesis known as panspermia. No less a personage than Francis Crick has actually speculated about that very idea, because Crick recognized that the conditions on the early Earth were so hostile to the formation of life through a spontaneous chemical evolutionary process that he said that the origin of life was a near miracle. And so he posited some sort of intelligence in space. Now, I've never thought that was a very good explanation, but it was at least a possible explanation for the origin of living systems, because they arise well after the beginning of the universe. And it's possible in principle that you could have some intelligence within the cosmos that's responsible for the information that's necessary to produce the first life on Earth. That explanation has an obvious problem, which is that any such super intelligence out in space would have, as Dawkins put it, would have had to have evolved by naturalistic processes, which means you would still have to explain the origin of the information that got that life form going, and then you'd be right back in the soup, back to the same problem that we have in explaining the origin of life here on Earth. But it's at least logically possible that life on Earth might have arisen from an intelligence somewhere else within the cosmos. But when you bring in evidence from physics and cosmology, and this is what I do in the new book, the evidence, and then look at the ensemble of evidence that we have together, the evidence of design in biology, the evidence of fine-tuning at the foundation of the universe and what the physicists talk about, and then the evidence that the universe itself had a definite beginning. When you look at all three of those classes of evidence together, I think the best explanation is not an immanent intelligence or even a deistic intelligence, but rather only an intelligence that has the attributes that Jews and Christians have long ascribed to God, namely transcendence. If we look at, for example, that immanent intelligent hypothesis, the space alien designer idea, clearly no being within the cosmos could be responsible for the exquisite fine-tuning of the laws of physics and the initial conditions of the universe that make its very life possible. And similarly, no being within the universe could be responsible for the origin of the universe itself. So the immanent designer hypothesis fails as an explanation for those two key facts. And what I do in the new book is look at not only the evidence we have about the origin of life, but also the origin of the universe and of its fine-tuning, and suggest that only classical theism can explain all three of those classes of evidence. Deism fails, for example, as an evidence of infusions of information into the biosphere, which is what we see on planet Earth. The deistic God would not act after the beginning. So a deistic God might explain the origin of the universe, but not the origin of life. The immanent intelligence might explain the origin of life, though again, I'm dubious, but it certainly wouldn't explain the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe or the origin of the universe itself. So that's kind of reasoning the book engages in, using this same method of historical scientific reasoning called inference to the best explanation, where we're looking at a pattern of evidence to see which hypothesis best explains the overarching pattern. And in this case, the pattern of evidence I'm looking at is these major origin events in the history of the universe and the history of life, to see which of these great metaphysical systems of thought, which worldview best explains the whole ensemble. And I conclude that it's a classical theism.
So, Steve, why is it that it's so difficult for scholars to actually consider that there might be a God hypothesis? What's the barrier?
Well, one of the things that I discuss in the book, in fact, it's the first three chapters, the first section of the book, is I tell the story of the rise of modern science within a different milieu intellectually. Modern science, almost all historians of science now see a very important connection between Judeo-Christian concepts of God and concepts of nature and the rise of modern science. Figures like Newton and Galileo and Kepler and Boyle were all devout Christians, and they had a Judeo-Christian understanding of nature. They believed that nature was intelligible because it had been created by an intelligent creator, and because it was this was a key watchword. They said it was intelligible, which meant that we could understand it. If we studied nature carefully, it had secrets to reveal, often in mathematical form, that we could perceive. And we could perceive them because our minds had been made in the image of the same creator who had built that rationality and design into the physical world. So the concept of a law of nature was a concept that came right out of the Hebrew Bible, and you don't really find it in the ancient Greeks. The metaphors that the early scientists used to describe nature, that nature was a clock, nature was a lawful realm, nature was a book. These were all theological metaphors, and that's what gave us modern science in the first place. In the late 19th century, we start to lose that as more and more scientists think that they can explain everything, the origin of the universe. Well, not the origin of the universe. No one really explained that. But people posited that it had been here eternally. But there were a series of theories about origins: the origin of the solar system, the origin of the new forms of life with Darwin, the origin of the first life, the origin of man. And by the end of the 19th century, you had this kind of seamless account of where everything had come from that did not require reference to a designing agent of any kind. And that gave rise, with some other developments, like thinkers like Marx and Freud, to a new worldview known as scientific materialism. And that worldview, rather than the prior theistic worldview, has really dominated the 20th century. And it's been kind of a default way of thinking. And what I do in the book is show that, first of all, where that came from, and give that worldview its due. It's been a very powerful system of thought, but it's now being challenged by scientific discoveries that address these big origins questions: the origin of the universe, the origin of the fine-tuning, the origin of life, the origin of new animals, the origin of human beings, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. There's a number of big questions at the intersection between science and philosophy that materialism has not adequately answered, and that is bringing back that theistic framework, and that's the point of the title, Return of the God Hypothesis.
Right, because there are questions that scientific materialism just can't answer, that's my understanding.
Well, in the book, I tell the story of a debate I had with a famous skeptic and proponent of scientific materialism who was previously raised as a Christian. And he always starts the debate by telling his deconversion story from Christianity. And after the debate was over, we had a long cab ride back to the airport together and we were both in the back, and we had a chance to talk more informally. And I asked him, well, tell me more about the story of your deconversion. What was it about science that caused you to lose your faith? And he said, well, it was just the success of science and explaining so many things. And I said, like what? And he said, well, like DNA. And I said, well,
Oh, you picked the wrong topic there, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he'd already conceded to me in the debate that he didn't have an explanation for the origin of the information in DNA. And he also mentioned, another big discovery was the Big Bang. And I said, well, but wait, what caused the Big Bang? And he admitted that, well, materialism didn't know that. And then I pressed him with about the fine tuning of the laws of physics. And he said, well, he said there's the multiverse hypothesis, that there could be billions of other universes out there that render the improbability, the fine-tuning, probable after all. And I said, yeah, but do you really believe that? And he said, nah, that there was all these other universes. And then I asked him about consciousness, and so it turns out that science does a great job of explaining how the universe functions, but we do not have materialistic scientific explanations for the origin of these major events in the history of life and the universe. I've been interested in these events in the history of the cosmos and the history of life, even before you get to the history of human beings, that are, I think, bear witness to the power of a designing agent, a creator, in bringing them into existence.
Well, I think that what I think is so important, Steve, with your work is the fact that you are. We have this company called Thinking Man Films that we've been making these films, and really for people to be thinking more clearly. And what I've seen is that you're really building a case to think clearly about the history of our origin, and that it's pointing back to there are answers that are not being given by a materialistic scientific approach, right? They don't have the answers for these things, whereas an intelligent designing creator provides those answers.
It's the best explanation, and we have ways of evaluating the explanatory power of hypotheses. One key criterion of that we use historical scientists use to examine the adequacy of an explanatory hypothesis is called causal adequacy. A space alien designer is not causally adequate to explain the origin of the universe itself. Because the space alien would have had to have arisen after the beginning of the universe. Chemical reactions are not adequate to explain the origin of code, because the chemistry that we see at work degrades things and moves away from life-friendly forms of biochemistry. And so by applying these standards or these criterion that are used to evaluate historical scientific explanations, it's actually possible to reason to first an intelligent designer, and then to an intelligent designer with the attributes of transcendence and intelligence and activity within the creation that Jews and Christians have always ascribed to God. And therefore, using a very rigorous method of reasoning, the same kind of reasoning we use for detectives or forensic scientists or historical scientists or in our everyday life, using the same methods of reasoning, we can actually address these big metaphysical questions and ask ourselves, well, what makes more sense here? Deism, theism, a space alien, or materialism? And that's the process of reasoning I engage in the book. It's kind of long, so it takes a bit of time to work through all this. But I think there's a very solid case to be made for theism based upon what we've discovered about the big events in biological and cosmological history.
What do you say to young people today that are really being attracted by a whole nother, let's say, scientific materialism? What do you say to them to say, like, hold on, don't give up your faith in God? What would you say?
Well, in brief, I say that the evidence is strongly against scientific materialism, and it strongly points to a designing intelligence and to theism. That the theists have the intellectual initiative in these discussions about the big questions of origin and the big questions about the origin and nature of human consciousness. Materialism is really, it's a failed late 19th century ideology. It still has tremendous cultural influence because it's the default way of thinking with many people in the knowledge culture, but that doesn't make it right, nor does it make it up to date when you look at the actual evidence that we have. And that's a big focus of the book, is that I tell the story of the rise of science in a theistic framework. It's the fall of that way of thinking in the late 19th century, but the way in which that way of thinking is coming back and needs to come back to explain three big discoveries that we've made about our universe: that the universe had a beginning, that it's been finely tuned for life from the beginning, and we've had big infusions of information into our biosphere since the beginning. And when you look at just those three big facts, that pattern of evidence supports a designing mind that also transcends matter, space, time, and energy, aka God. So the theistic hypothesis, I think, is very powerful. It has huge explanatory power, as John Lennox likes to emphasize in the film that we're going to talk about next with Steve Huff.
That's great. Well, everyone, I want to get links to you for these books, and you can follow this whole video series that Steve is producing, and we're going to make it available to you in the links. So just keep an eye out for that. Thank you, Steve, for helping us with this interview on the Historical Faith Society. It's great to have you and see you again.
Tim, thanks for having me on, and apologize for the shaggy hair. We're having trouble getting haircuts these days, but you look so good on camera, and I'm noticing maybe I should have found some way to get a trim, but it's strange times right now, and I think it's times like these actually, I think, also make people open to thinking about the deeper questions. We have a country very divided about politics, but I think when we think about these deeper things, it could start to bring us together again.
I think so. I think there's a lot of people right now that are asking big questions about life and what does it all mean. So thanks again, Steve.
Well, thank you. And thanks for your Historical Faith Society asking those big questions.